Since 1980, an average of 4 countries a year have abolished the death penalty, meaning each year fewer and fewer of the 190 plus countries believe that death is a suitable punishment for crime. However, many countries still utilize the death penalty. These countries include China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and our own nation, the United States. It is important to examine the United States' use of the death penalty. As a leading power in the world, the U.S. serves as an example to other countries. If we as a nation still employ the death penalty as a punishment, it sets a precedent to other nations. Currently, over 3,000 people in the United States are on death row. In our nation's history, 1,235 people have been put to death because of the death sentence. This is not to say the people were and are not guilty. The fact of the matter is, the majority of the people on death row are guilty of heinous crimes. However, many argue an eye for an eye mentality is not justified for many reasons. One reason being that we do not have a proper structure to judge the severity of one crime compared to another. This is clear in the punishment of the 2 men responsible for the worst case of domestic violence in the United States history, the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. The tragedy took the lives of 169 people and affected the lives of countless others. The 2 men responsible were Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. McVeigh was charged with the killing of 8 FBI agents. His punishment was death by lethal injection. Nichols was charged with the death of the other 161 people deemed civilians. His punishment was life without parole. This outcome suggests that the lives of those 8 federal agents were more important than the lives of the 161 civilians. Certainly the family members of the 161 civilians would not agree. Who had the power to decide that McVeigh's crime was more severe? Who has the power to decide the worst of the worst? Many believe that no one has this power, and for that reason, the death penalty should be taken off the table as a suitable form of punishment. Other arguments in the United States against the death penalty include the mental state of criminals, the age of criminals, flaws in the legal system, and unreasonable economic standpoints. Despite one's stand on the death penalty, at the end of the day, the United States employs the death penalty against those who have committed homicidal crimes. This is not the same story in other countries who still use the death penalty. In many other countries, it is more important to live what is considered an honorable life than to have life at all. In the Middle East, most of the people sentenced to death are convicted of a non-homicide crime. For instance, adultery, according to Sharia law in Iran, is shameful and punishable by death. For this reason, many people, the majority of which are women, are sentenced to death for shaming their family. This execution is often brutal and public. In many cases, the victims will be buried up to their waists and then stoned to death by the public. Those performing the execution would claim that those receiving it acted without honor, morals, or dignity, and therefore deserved the punishment they received. However, it is impossible, at least for me, to find any dignity in publicly killing people in a brutal way for a crime that would go without punishment in our nation. The Middle East is not the only region that uses death for reasons that seem unfit for punishment. Throughout history, around the world, people have been subject to persecution for factors that they have no control over. This has created an alarming amount of world refugees. According to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political party, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. In 1967, the definition expanded to include persons who fled because of war or other violence. It is most important to remember refugees exist because of persecution. Unlike the death penalty, that in theory uses execution against those who commit serious crimes, persecution uses death as a punishment because of factors that one is born into. Take, for example, ethnic cleansing, perhaps the most well-known issue of unjust persecution. Ethnic cleansing is the lasting memory of World War II, when those of Jewish faith were scapegoated, tortured, and mass murdered to make way for Hitler's Aryan race. Sadly, there have also been more recent cases of mass murder. Yugoslavia in the 1990s was being tormented by the Yellow Wasps, a Serbian unit that tortured and murdered many Bosnian refugees they did not see as ethnically clean. At a similar time, in another part of the world, a different culture was experiencing similar brutality. In the early 1990s in Rwanda, Africa, genocide was happening between the Hutu and Tutsi people, a war between neighbors, where the enemy was being labeled simply for what group they belonged to. One should make no mistake in believing the United States is without issues of persecution, even in these more modern times. Many people have been persecuted because they are labeled different. Take, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. He was assassinated in 1968 for leading the civil rights movement for African Americans. 10 years later, in 1978, Harvey Milk, a symbol of gay political achievement, was assassinated. Though both were murdered by people with radical beliefs, they were murdered nonetheless because of factors they could not control. Like those executed for unhonorable behavior in the Middle East, King and Milk were killed because people felt their race, beliefs, and sexual orientation lacked honor.